One of the hardest things, it seems to me, to convey in teaching history or writing history, and one of the most important to convey, is that nothing ever had to happen the way it happened. We're so often presented history as this following that, and we're meant to get that straight because it will be on the test on Wednesday. And we begin to think, after a good many years of that process, that that had to be that way. And it never did. Events of all kinds could have gone off in any number of different directions, excuse me, for any number of different reasons, anywhere along the line, just as in our own lives. The other point I would like to make is that if you think about it, nothing ever really happened in the past. Nobody ever lived in the past. They lived in the present. It was their present and different from ours, and that's important, how different it was. But they lived in the present. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, they didn't walk around saying, "Isn't this fascinating, living in the past? Aren't we quaint in our funny clothes?" And they didn't know how things were going to turn out. I don't think one can overemphasize how important that is. They don't know how it's going to turn out. They don't know what happens in the long run any more than we do. And it's often very easy to look at it from our vantage point of the present, our present, and say, well, why didn't they do this, or they should have done that, or those people shouldn't have given up what they did, and so forth and so on. And that's, to a large extent, the hubris of the present, that somehow we are superior. Somehow we know so much more than those poor folks back there living in that poorly lighted time. In many ways, I think the more one involves oneself in that other time, the more one comes to conclude that in many ways they were superior to us. They were strong people, and they were used to hardship, used to hard work, used to the fear of epidemic disease, the fear of the unknown, because so much about the epidemic disease then was unknown. What caused it? When will it go away? The inevitable inconveniences and discomforts of that time that we don't know at all. Even in peacetime, life was a struggle, and particularly in New England. One grew up in New England learning from experience to expect the worst. So when we read about what hardships the soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War endured, we shouldn't by any means say, well, they didn't mind it too much. Of course they suffered terribly, but they were very tough people. And soldiers and farmers know about weather. And soldiers and farmers are who we're talking about, since almost all the soldiers were farmers. One of the most poignant lines of all the letters that I've worked with over the last 10 years is from Abigail Adams, written that same summer of 1776 to her husband, who was off in Philadelphia serving in the Continental Congress. Posterity who are to reap the blessings will scarcely be able to conceive the hardships and sufferings of their ancestors. She knew it then, and she, alas, was right. We don't know what they went through. 1776 was the most important year of the most important conflict in our history, the Revolutionary War. Without the Revolutionary War, there would be no United States of America. The Revolutionary War, furthermore, was the longest war in our history, except for Vietnam, 8.5 years. And it was the bloodiest war in our history, except for the Civil War. 25,000 Americans lost their lives. Now, that doesn't seem like very much by our terms, but by their terms, it was catastrophic. 1% of the population, 2,500,000 people in all of the 13 colonies. Were we fighting such a war today, we would lose over 3 million people, to give you some idea of what they sacrificed. And of course, the dead are not the only sacrifice, nor were the soldiers who marched with Washington the only people who suffered. But suffer they did, nor did it look very encouraging, ever. There was a night in the winter of 1776, early in 1776, just up the way here on Brattle Street at what we call the Longfellow House, which was Washington's headquarters, and ought to be so understood as to be that as well as the Longfellow House, when Washington was tossing and turning at night, unable to sleep, as he recorded in a letter. The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour, when all around me are wrapped in sleep. Few people know the predicament we are in. So it isn't just that we don't know today what they suffered then, what they went through then, how bleak, how dark, how in many ways hopeless it appeared. But he's saying that few people then knew. Now, who were they? Well, we have a pretty good idea who George Washington was. But in my view, we need to know more. He's not the marble man. He's not unapproachable. He's not aloof or arrogant or unkind or stuffy. He's a leader. That's foremost. He isn't an intellectual like John Adams or Jefferson. He isn't a great strategist or tactician like Napoleon. He isn't a passionate, persuasive speaker like Patrick Henry. He's a leader. He has absolute integrity. He has, for lack of any better word that I know, character. He has phenomenal courage, which is the first thing required in a leader because everything else depends on that. And it's both physical and moral courage. He is steadfast. He will not quit. And he never loses sight of what the war is about. And he conveys this courage and self-control and dedication to the glorious cause of America, as they called it, in such a way that others feel deeply his feelings and will follow him through hell. Now, not all of them did, by any means. Not all of them were heroes. They deserted in droves by the hundreds. Many, when their enlistments were up, marched right off to home as fast as they could go, by the thousands, both from here and later on in December when Washington was retreating across New Jersey and couldn't spare a man, let alone 2,000 of his men, who just walked away with no shame whatsoever when they were most desperately needed. And many went over to the enemy. We mustn't forget that. Hundreds of them went over to the enemy, right here. Just as many of the enemy came over to our side. There was a lot of back and forthing, often depending whether there was food enough to keep them going or clothes enough to keep them warm. British sentries froze to death here around Boston in that winter. The only losses, the only American fatalities during the attack at Trenton were 2 men on the 9-mile march after they had crossed the Delaware, on the 9-mile march down to Trenton to hit Trenton the next morning, who died on the march because they froze to death. And yes, they did, many of them, have no shoes, and yes, they did leave bloody footprints in the snow. All true. But George Washington was also a man who, when these awful nights came down on him, and there were many of them far worse than those he suffered here in Cambridge, who would sit down and write long, long letters back to his home at Mount Vernon to tell the people there how he wanted the wainscoting done of the new addition to the house, what color paint he wanted used, what sort of siding should be on the new kitchen. You read them and you think, wait a minute, what's going on? And they're extensive letters, and every detail is important to him. And then I thought of something that happened during the Second World War, when Eisenhower was given command of D-Day, and he went to London to take over in the headquarters on Grosvenor Square. Churchill said to him, Ike, you've got to find something to do, something to think about, a hobby, other than your work, because the burdens you're going to be under are going to be so enormous that without some sort of diversion you will crack. And he urged Eisenhower to take up painting, which Eisenhower did. Churchill said, it's helped me a great deal, and I think you'll like it. Well, Eisenhower loved it. He became pretty good at it, not as good as Churchill, who was superb. But I think that Washington's imaginary leap from the winter of 76 here in Cambridge, or the winter, the December at the end of 76, retreating across New Jersey, I think that was for him what painting was for Churchill and Eisenhower. It helped him to keep from cracking. He bore a burden of gloom and doom such as I don't know of any man carrying in such a position of tremendous responsibility. His health was phenomenal. While people all around him, virtually everyone, was getting sick with something or other, he never was ill once that we know of in that year. This is also true of Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a Boston bookseller, a great, big, fat, gregarious young man that everybody liked and who was impossible to ignore. He had the idea to go to Ticonderoga and bring back the guns left there after Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys had captured the fort in May of 1775. The guns were still there, but Fort Ticonderoga was over 300 miles away in upstate New York, and he had proposed to do this in the midst of winter, and he did it. Now, what's so interesting is that Henry Knox was 25 years old. Henry Knox knew no more about the military or artillery than what he'd read in books. Nor did Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, who was all of 33 when they made him a general, knew no more about the military or being in the army or fighting a war than what he'd read in books. But you see, that was an age when people believed that reading books wasn't a bad way to learn things. That's the spirit of the Enlightenment, the faith of the Enlightenment, vividly personified by these two men who, like Washington, had no formal schooling beyond about 5th grade, but who never stopped reading. And, of course, it was a young man's war, a young woman's war, a young cause. Washington was 43 when he took command here in Cambridge. We see the old fellow in his white powdered hair and the awkward teeth, the founding father, the elder statesman. He wasn't that yet, not for a very long time to come. And he was the oldest of them. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, 33 years old. Benjamin Rush, who in many ways is one of the most interesting of them all, the famous physician of that time who was the first to urge that people with mental illness be treated humanely. Benjamin Rush was all of 30 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. They're young, they're inexperienced. They've never fought a revolution. No people had ever successfully revolted against the mother country. This country had no army, it had no navy, it had no money, and it had no prior experience. There was no Che Guevara who'd done it before somewhere else. And they'd never founded a country. And they're all coming out of this tiny population of 2,500,000 people, 500,000 of whom, as you might recall, were held in bondage as slaves, black men, women, and children. And, of course, there's the glaring incongruity that many of them were themselves slave masters, including George Washington. They postponed that issue, as they would postpone that issue again with the Constitution. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To what extent did the Declaration of Independence inspire these soldiers? Very hard to know for certain. It absolutely inspired people like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox. It certainly was a powerful morale moment when Washington ordered that the Declaration of Independence be read aloud to everybody in New York, all of the Army in New York, when the document itself reached New York in its full text. And when that happened, I want to read you what Nathaniel Greene said. Excuse me, I wonder if I can find it. I just tell you that what happened was that Knox said, "Now, how we play our parts will affect generations and generations to come." That's an extremely important observation, because Knox is saying how we play our parts, and this idea that they are cast in roles unlike anybody has ever been cast before, in one of the great dramatic turning points in history, permeates all that they say. Washington, Adams, Knox, Greene, all of them. Except when you get down in the ranks. You don't read that much. There is no mention that I know of in the memoir of Joseph Plum Martin, a 16-year-old Army volunteer, soldier, foot soldier, who wrote a wonderful memoir later. There's no mention of it in the diaries of Jabez Fitch, another Connecticut farmer with 8 children. No mention of the Declaration of Independence that I know of in the papers of my favorite Joseph Hudgkins, who was a cobbler from Ipswich. They may have indeed been fighting for the Declaration of Independence and its noble ideals, but they don't talk about it much. They talk about winning. They talk about surviving till the next day. They talk about doing their part, and they talk again and again about the glorious cause of America. Now, keep in mind that when the soldiers who went out to face the British redcoats at Lexington and Concord leveled their muskets on the enemy, they were not fighting for independence, nor were they doing so at Bunker Hill. They were fighting, in their view, in their hearts and minds, for their rights as freeborn Englishmen. It is only in 1776 when this idea of independence takes hold, and it's only after the text of a speech given by the King of England before Parliament in October arrives here in Boston, in Cambridge, on the very first day of the new year, January 1, 1776. And word of that text of that speech spread through this town, spread through Boston like wildfire, and out into the countryside. Because the king had said that the Americans are in rebellion and that their leaders are traitors and that we are going to crush that rebellion. In other words, it wasn't just going to be a brief family squabble. Washington wrote his wife, Martha, that he would be home by Christmas. That thought all passed by the way on the first day of January 1776. When one finishes reading about this year, when you live inside the diaries and letters of the people who were there, who saw it, who fought it, who survived it, you come away with several very powerful feelings that I think, for me at least, will stay with me for the rest of my life. One is that they did everything for us, because the words of the Declaration of Independence would have been just that, words on paper, had it not been for them. that when we celebrate the 4th of July, we shouldn't just be celebrating those noble ideals. That's important for sure. We shouldn't just be imagining the 1776 of the Broadway show. All those eminent leaders in their magnificent 18th century attire parading around on stage like somebody in a costume pageant. That was part of it, and a very important part. But there are these other people, mostly long forgotten, but by no means have their traces been eliminated. They are there. We can read what happened. We can hear their voices in their own words. If our satisfaction with ourselves, if our abundance and our amplitude of opportunities are so hypnotizing to us that we forget about those people and we take what we have for granted, what kind of a country are we? We profess we love our country. What would somebody who professes to love another man or another woman or your father or your mother but knows nothing about them, what kind of love would that be? We are a very interesting country, and the shame of it is that so few people know much about it. Now, I don't think we ought to read history and read about the Revolutionary War, read about any period that fascinates you or others, because it's necessarily going to make us more grateful for what we have. It will. Or that it will make us a better citizen. It will. Or that it will help us to understand human nature far better than almost anything else one could study. And it will. But also as a source of pleasure. You couldn't invent a novel that would have such incredible events that take place as in this year, 1776. You read what happened and you say, that just doesn't happen in real life. But it did. When time and again the weather, literally which way the wind was blowing, would determine the outcome, not just of one battle or one engagement, but of the war. If the wind had been in a different direction the night of August 29th, 1776, on the East River in New York, I think it would have been all over. Because it would have taken only the British fleet to come up into the East River and seal off any possible escape by Washington and the Army from Brooklyn Heights. They would have had them right in the bag, exactly the same way we had the British in the bag at Yorktown when the French fleet arrived at exactly the right time to seal off any retreat there. One of the great ironies of the war. There's one point when the Continental Army is retreating across New Jersey, when all they have left are 3,000 men. Probably a fourth of whom are sick. Most of them have no winter clothing. They've done nothing but lose and lose and lose again for months. 3,000 men, and the whole future of the country and all that the Declaration embodied was riding on those people. So what Washington did when all hope was lost is what we often have to do when all hope is lost. He attacked. He came across the Delaware, struck at Trenton, and history changed because we had beaten them. It wasn't a big battle. It wasn't a grand European-style conflict. But it changed history because it changed what was in people's hearts, their morale, their attitude. And then he struck a few days later in the first week of 1777 at Princeton and won again. I've been at this now for 40 years, and I've been very fortunate in my subjects. And I've loved the work I've done on every book I've written. But I have never enjoyed so much what I've been doing as working in the 18th century. Bill and I were talking about this backstage before the evening began. There's something about those people from whom we can learn more than we have any idea. And how fortunate we are that they did what they did. That's my talk.
Thank you very much, David. This is the Cambridge Forum with David McCullough, speaking about his book, 1776. David, you've been a very powerful voice for American history, and you've traveled around America extensively. I wonder if you have any comments that you might wish to share with us about the teaching of American history in our schools today.
Well, we've got a big job to do. We're raising several generations of young Americans who are, by and large, historically illiterate. And it's very apparent on the campuses of the best colleges and universities in the country, including the one across the street. And it can be discouraging, but I think some progress is being made. First of all, I feel strongly that we need to revise how we're teaching our teachers. We ought to do away with schools of education and degrees in education. We ought to have teachers graduating with a good liberal arts education with a major in a real subject, not just history, but all the other subjects. It's a terrible thing to turn a young person loose to teach history or botany or physics or whatever it is, not knowing anything about it. And it happens all over the country every year. 80% of the teachers teaching history in our schools and colleges, in our colleges nationwide, did not have any history in college. And that's important but for two reasons. First, beyond the obvious reason, it's hard to teach something that you don't know anything about. The second is that you can't love something you don't know anything about. You can't love someone you don't know. You can't love a subject you don't know anything about. And you know from your own experience, the best teachers, the most effective teachers, the teachers that really can change your life are the teachers who love what they're teaching. The second thing is if you don't know what you're teaching, you become much more dependent on the textbooks. And in the field of history, the textbooks, with only a few exceptions in my view, are dreary in the extreme. They are really deadly. Sometimes I feel that they were written with this particular intent of killing any interest that anyone might have in history. There are wonderful people teaching history today, all over the country. But alas, they are fewer and fewer in number. Furthermore, I think teachers are the most important people in our society, by far. I don't think there's anyone doing more important work than teachers. It is the greatest of all professions, in my view. And we've got to get over the idea that too many people have that the teachers are sort of glorified babysitters who look after our children or grandchildren while we're off doing the important work. They are doing the important work. But my strongest message, if that's proper, is something I've learned from one of my daughters. Her name is Dory Lawson, and last year she published a book called Posterity, The Letters of Great Americans to Their Children. And in the process of writing that book, she read thousands of letters from prominent Americans to their children, all the way from the 17th century down to the present. And she learned so much from how those interesting and often brilliant people related to their children or coached their children or talked with their children through the medium of a letter. And the more she thought about the problems of teaching history today, the more she came to the conclusion that the problem with education in our country today is us. That we have to be talking about history with our children and grandchildren. We have to bring up the subject of history, or a favorite period in history, or a favorite figure in history at the dinner table. Bring back the dinner table conversation. Bring back dinner. And I know in my own experience, now granted, a very different generation, but our family sat down to dinner every night promptly at 6:30, and the talk began at once. And it was often about events during the day, or it was often my father asking a question, or my mother taking up some subject that interested her, often politics, and very often history. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Mabel Rankin, thought that Franklin Roosevelt could walk on water. She thought he was the greatest human being second greatest human being that ever lived. And my father thought that Franklin Roosevelt was the worst thing that ever happened to this country. And they would go to it. And what made those discussions so memorable is that both of them were exceedingly hard of hearing. So with the decibel level alone, I know all about the New Deal. We have to take our children, our grandchildren, to historic sites. Take them to, right up Brattle Street, to Washington's headquarters, to the Longfellow House. And get Jim Shea, who runs that wonderful historic site, to show you around. I think Jim might be here tonight. Jim, are you here? There he is. Stand up. Go see Jim Shea. Go to the Longfellow House. Walk into what was Washington's study, the fireplace there, and imagine who was in that room. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Abigail Adams. That's where Washington met with his generals to decide whether or not to attack the British in Boston. That's where he met with Henry Knox to send him on that far-flung venture off to Ticonderoga. If those old walls could speak, they could tell you more than you could ever imagine. But it isn't hard to imagine. Take them to Concord and Lexington. Take them to Gettysburg. Take them to Monticello and Mount Vernon. That's the way to do it. And it will give us all something more to talk about just than sports or what was on television. Now, people right away say, oh, but we haven't any time to do that. You don't understand. I understand. The average family today watches 3 to 4 hours of television every single day. Turn it off, go out and do something beneficial and interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think now the floor is